Chapter 19. Who Controls Coincidences? Right from the very first appearance of the Anastasia book, there have been quite a number of articles written by various scholars on the Anastasia phenomenon. Many of them included references to me. Whenever I heard or read unflattering remarks about myself, even if they temporarily upset me, it wasn't for long, maybe a day or two, a week at the most. My insides would get stirred up a bit, but then it was history. But this time, excuse me, at a meeting in Moscow, one of my readers handed me an audio cassette. He said it was a recording of a talk given at an academic conference by the leader of a scholarly research group which was studying the Anastasia phenomenon. I listened to the cassette a few days later. What I heard was beyond belief. Its message, once it had sunk in, not only knocked me off the rails, it seemed it was going to do me in for good, really do me in, especially my own self-esteem. Before listening to it, I was planning to head off again to the Tiger to see Anastasia and my son, but after hearing it, I put my plans on hold. Here's what I heard, slightly abbreviated. My respected colleagues, I should like to present you with some of the conclusions and arguments worked out by a research group I head on the basis of over 3 years investigating the phenomenon we shall call Anastasia. In my report, I shall use the name Anastasia not just for the sake of convenience, but because the subject of our investigation has presented itself under that name. This does not rule out the possibility of giving it a more specific and characteristic definition in the future. It's difficult to do that at the moment, since I am persuaded that we are dealing with something that surpasses the boundaries of traditional academic disciplines and possibly modern science on the whole. We began by defining 3 research questions. A. The truthfulness of the events described by the author Vladimir Megre in his books. B. Megre's books themselves. And C. Public reaction to Megre's books. At the end of the first 6 months, it was clear that the truthfulness or untruthfulness of the events described in the book was an irrelevant question. The wild emotional reaction of most readers who have had contact with Megre's books has nothing to do with whether the events described are real or not. Public reaction is determined by a different set of factors entirely. However, the time and resources and intellectual potential we spent pursuing this question led to what is, in my opinion, a rather interesting conclusion, namely that the tendency of individuals, including sociologists and academic circles in general, to cast doubt on Anastasia's existence is in fact a contributing factor to the very phenomenon we are studying. It is this very hoopla surrounding the question, does she or doesn't she exist, that has enabled the phenomenon to penetrate unhindered into all levels of society today. The denial of the existence of Anastasia has actually served to neutralize any opposition to her designs. If she doesn't exist, after all, then it follows that there is no object to study, nothing to oppose. On the other hand, the public reaction to Anastasia's sayings attests to the vital necessity of research to determine her significance and intellectual capabilities. As to the truthfulness of the events set forth in the books, we can state the following. In describing these events, the author not only presents self under his own name, but does not shield anyone else connected with these events. No effort to change the real names of people or places or to cover up embarrassing facts about himself. For example, the episode described in the first book where Megre, in the presence of the captain, flirts with the local country girls visiting the ship during a pleasure cruise, being fully documented as fact. Crew members have also confirmed the presence that evening of a quiet and taciturn young woman with a kerchief tied around her head. Megre showed this woman around the ship, then spent some time alone with her in his cabin. From the book we learn that this was the first appearance of the Siberian recluse Anastasia on Megre's lead ship, the one that served as his headquarters. It was the entrepreneur's first encounter with the Siberian recluse, and their first conversation together. The chronology of many of the events described in the book has been confirmed by documents and eyewitness accounts. Not only that, but other situations even more extraordinary have come to light, which the author, for one reason or another, did not describe in his books. A notable case in point is Megre's stay in a Novosibirsk city hospital, where medical records indicate the progress of his illness, medical test results, the prolongation of his illness, and his remarkable recovery. We have determined that his recovery immediately followed the doctor's application of cedar oil, which was left at the hospital by an unidentified woman. I shan't deny that, carried away as we were in our pursuit of the truth of the events described in the book, and with access to criminological facilities, for example, we were in a position to prove or disprove a great deal. We were halted in this pursuit, however, by the public's wild and extraordinary reaction to Megre's books, or more specifically to Anastasia's sayings therein recorded. The details of Megre's intimate relations were not a drawing card for most people. They were excited instead by Anastasia's monologues. Even our initial investigation of this reaction, and especially its latest manifestations, clearly indicated that something calling itself Anastasia is exercising an unmistakable influence on today's society. Her sphere of influence continues to increase in size even today. And we need to pay greater attention to even the most improbable arguments. Try to discern them and follow them up. In all probability, the phenomenon known as Anastasia possesses powers and abilities which our mind and consciousness are not in a position to fully make sense of. In Megre's very first book, in the chapter entitled Across the Dark Forces Window of Time, the phenomenon predicts not only the appearance of the book, but also how and by what means she will capture people's minds and consciousness. In a monologue, Anastasia affirms that she has collected from various ages the best combinations of sounds to be found in the universe, and that they will have a positive influence on people. She affirms that this action is quite simple. As you can see, it is simply a matter of translating the combinations of signs from the depth of eternity and infinity of the universe, exact in sense, meaning, and purpose. Our group as a whole reached a unanimous conclusion. This particular saying is an invention. This conclusion was based on the following logical and, as we believed, irrefutable argument. Even if certain unusual combinations do exist in the book, then they cannot exercise any influence over the reader, since there is no instrument to reproduce them. The book cannot utter sounds, and consequently cannot convey to our hearing the sounds of the universe said to have been collected by Anastasia. Later, however, Anastasia did give the following answer. You are right, a book does not make sounds, but it can serve as a score. Like a musical score, the reader will involuntarily utter within himself any sound he reads. Thus, the hidden combinations in the text will resonate in the reader's soul in their pristine form, with no distortion. They are bearers of truth and healing, and they will fill the soul with inspiration. No artificial instrument is capable of reproducing what resonates in the soul. In his third book, The Space of Love, Megre sets forth Anastasia's dialogue with the scholars, but for some unknown reason he abbreviates it, or if we assume that the phenomenon itself participated in the book's appearance, then it is possible that it deliberately omitted the continuation of Anastasia's response to the scholars. What for? Possibly to leave the unbelievers in their state of inaction. The fact remains that proofs of Anastasia's incredible declaration do exist. Here is the continuation of Anastasia's dialogue with the scholars. To her adversary's statement that the blending within man of certain sounds, not part of human speech, has never been anywhere established as fact, Anastasia replied as follows: "It has been established, and I can give you an example. But it must be an example everybody can relate to. Fine. Ludwig van Beethoven. What about him? His Ode to Joy. That was the name he gave to his Ninth Symphony. It was written for a symphony orchestra and mass choirs. Okay, but how can that prove your statement about the evocation of sounds within the reader's mind? Sounds that nobody's ever heard. Sounds evoked within the mind of the reader of a book are heard by the reader alone. There, you see, by the reader alone. That means there's no proof. And your example with Beethoven's symphony isn't convincing. At the time he wrote his Ninth Symphony, Ode to Joy, Ludwig van Beethoven was deaf," responded Anastasia. "This fact is attested by Beethoven's biographers. Not only that, but the deaf composer himself conducted the first performance of his symphony. In the light of this particular historical fact, Anastasia's next saying no longer raised any doubts. Every letter or combination of letters from any text being uttered can be transformed into sound. A page of text can be compared to a page from a musical score. It is simply a question of who is able to set forth the note letters and how. Will they comprise a great symphony or simply audible chaos? And another question, does everyone have an instrument of sufficiently high quality within themselves to reproduce the full orchestration?" The researchers in our group subsequently came to the following conclusion. Anastasia's sayings in respect to the derivatives of explosion, transportation by creating a vacuum, purification of the air, agro-technical methods, the significance of cedar oil in the treatment of many diseases, the energy of man produce thought, as well as many other phenomena, deserve the most meticulous study by scientific circles. In arriving at this conclusion, our group does not make any claim to be the first to discover it. Scholars in Novosibirsk came to it at the same time or even a little ahead of us, as may be seen in a presentation by the leader of the Novosibirsk Scholars Circle, Sergei Speransky, in a published paper entitled "It's More Useful to Believe." The Novosibirsk psychologist Nina Zutikova came up with the following conclusion on the basis of her sociological research. One's relationship to Anastasia is not dependent on the presence or absence of academic degrees, but very much depends on a man's character, his scale of values, on his conscious and subconscious mindset, i.e., on a man's personality and all its elements. It depends on whether this man wants Anastasia to be real or not. It depends on how open a man's consciousness is, on the degree that it is ready to accept amazing phenomena that go beyond the bounds of commonality. What is revealed to us and how? This depends on the characteristics of our time and corresponds to the level of our own self-awareness. Possibly the Novosibirsk researchers could have gone even farther than ours, but the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences declined to finance them. Today, our group, having received a commission and consequently pre-arranged funding, is already in a position to state with confidence and the support of evidence the following fact. Our civilization has witnessed a phenomenon never before subject to scientific measurement, nor, consequently, to scientific definition. Our research must attract not only representatives of modern scientific disciplines, especially physicists and psychologists, but esoterics too. The processes taking place in our society under the influence of the Anastasia phenomenon are evident and actual, and we cannot, in fact, We do not even have the right to leave them unstudied. Some of the events described in Meg Ray's books indeed look like fiction at first glance, and we have endeavoured to treat them with scepticism. Nevertheless, the subsequent events that happen to the author, but are not described in the books, are even more incredible. But the incredible has happened, and we find ourselves obliged to draw conclusions which are difficult even for us to believe. One of the conclusions is that Vladimir Megre does not exist, and that there's no point in studying his biography for an explanation of what has happened. What appears at first glance to be a rather far-fetched conclusion removes and explains a whole host of improbabilities. Namely, how did it happen that an ordinary Siberian entrepreneur suddenly became capable of writing a book, a series of books, now which has become one of the most popular in Russia? The speculations put forth in the press, upon closer inspection, turn out to be unfounded. A bankrupt entrepreneur decides to settle his affairs by becoming a writer. But we have a lot of bankrupt entrepreneurs, yet not one of them has ever become a famous writer. He managed to think up a sensational storyline, but the storyline has nothing to do with it. Our esoteric press does nothing but publish sensational stories about unusual phenomena week after week. Super healers, flying saucers and aliens, yet the public hardly bats an eyelid. And these stories are prepared by professional writers and journalists. Meg Ray's books have a powerful publicity engine working for them. Just the opposite, many publications are now trying to promote themselves on the back of Meg Ray's books. We have established beyond a doubt that Meg Ray's first 3 books were published without even any exposure in bookstores, not by a publishing firm and with a large distribution network, but by Moscow Print Shop number 11, which doesn't deal in the book trade at all. And yet, here, people have been standing in queue for Meg Ray's books, and the wholesalers have been paying advances up front to carry them, even before they're published. In the minds of many book dealers, the popularity of Meg Ray's books flies in the face of all book business norms and goes against experts' predictions concerning consumer demand. So what is the result? Did Vladimir Meg Ray miraculously become a genius out of the blue? Nothing miraculous about it. I repeat, Vladimir Meg Ray, the entrepreneur who was well known in Siberia, simply does not exist today. Evidence in support of this argument may be found through a careful reading of Anastasia's sayings back in the first book. Let's recall her words addressed to Vladimir. You will write this book, guided only by feelings and your heart. You will not be able to do otherwise, since you have not mastered the technique of writing, but through your feelings you can do anything. These feelings are already within you, both mine and yours. Note carefully Anastasia's last words cited here. These feelings are already within you, both mine and yours. This means that Vladimir Meg Ray's own sense perception of the world has been supplemented with that of Anastasia's. We should not examine how and by what means this supplementing was effected. We shall accept it as a fact, which engenders the following conclusion. If to one defined magnitude another is added, then the aggregate of the 2 magnitudes engenders a 3rd independent magnitude. Hence, the present Meg Ray's date of birth cannot be determined by the date registered on his official birth certificate. There is more justification in considering his birth date to be in 1994, i.e. the moment he met Anastasia. Even though the outward appearance of the new individual corresponds to the former Meg Ray, the radical difference between the 2 is all too apparent. This includes, for example, both the literary talent and his ability to hold an audience's attention for an extended period of time, 5 hours or more, as has been twice attested by witnesses to his appearance at the Readers' Conference in the city of Gelendzhik in Krasnodar region. This fact is reflected in accounts in a number of national magazines. Many researchers and journalists have got caught up in comparisons and investigations of events connected with the activities of Vladimir Megrez, just on the basis of the description in the books. They've been attempting to prove, either subconsciously or openly and aggressively, that this cannot be so. My dear colleagues, I am inclined to believe, and not without some justification, that the following communications will convince you that such a feeling is nothing more than a defence mechanism found in those whose mind or consciousness is incapable of making sense of what is really going on. Vladimir Megrez himself, or more accurately, part of his own self, is even less capable than that of making sense of the events he is involved in. It's just that he has gradually become accustomed to them and is beginning to categorize even the most incredible phenomena as normal or commonplace, which has also served to keep him from having a nervous breakdown. I think that, like many readers, he did not pay any special attention to what Anastasia said to him back at the first meeting with him in the Taiga. When Megrez protested, "I shan't even make an attempt to write anything," Anastasia responded, "Believe me, you shall. They have already created a whole network of circumstances that will make you do this." This dialogue is given right in book 1, but in Megrez's subsequent books there isn't even an attempt to return to this question. Who, in fact, are these mysterious they? Upon receiving specific information, the members of our group once more delved into the dialogues reproduced in the first book and selected all the references to this they scattered over its pages. I shall cite these references in Anastasia's words. "If it had not been for them, and for me too, a little, your second expedition would not have been possible. I want you to be purified. This is why I thought back then about your trip to holy places, about the book. They have accepted this, and the forces of darkness are always fighting with them, but never have the dark forces scored a major victory. My plan and conscious awareness were precise and realistic, and they accepted them. They are answerable only to God." The following conclusion can be drawn from Anastasia's sayings. Some intermediate forces will set in place for Megrez. Some kind of network of circumstances compelling him to carry out action somebody's pre-programmed for him. And if that is so, then Megrez's role as an individual in his creations amounts to nil, or at least something very insignificant. Everything is simply being handed him on a platter through his network of supposedly coincidental circumstances. This also means that the individual of the past known as Megrez has evidently been violated. We decided that if we succeed in establishing certain anomalies in Megrez's behaviour, or rather the presence of a network of circumstances, or so-called coincidences, such a presence could confirm or disprove A. the reality of what happened in the Taiga, B. the degree of participation of Megrez as an individual in the events taking place in society surrounding the publication of his books, and C. the existence of some kind of forces capable of producing coincidences influencing man's destiny. The episode in Megrez's life, which we have managed to examine in the greatest detail, right down to individual nuances, is his behaviour on Cyprus in June 1999. During the time when he was working on his fourth book, Co-Creation, it would even be more accurate to say that he was in the process of figuring out the meaning of his dialogues with Anastasia, which he had already transcribed, about the creation of the earth and man. What we discovered on Cyprus can only be summed up in one short phrase: what is it? let me acquaint you with certain events that took place there. At the end of May 1999, Vladimir Megrey took a Transavia flight to Cyprus, but not as a member of a tourist group. There was nobody he knew on Cyprus. He did not know any of the languages spoken on the island. The Cyprus travel agency, Leptos, placed this individual Russian tourist in a single room on the second floor of a small hotel. The room had a balcony overlooking a fair-sized pool where tourists, mainly from England and Germany, would lounge around and have fun. Megrey's Russian travel agent had informed the manager of Leptos that this particular tourist was a Russian writer, but that was hardly news to a major travel firm like Leptos, accustomed to hosting world-famous celebrities. As far as they were concerned, Megrey was just an ordinary tourist. Nevertheless, on the second day of his stay, he was approached by the senior company manager responsible for the Russian tourist market with an offer to show him around the city, including the estates the company itself had developed. They brought along a Russian-speaking interpreter employed by the firm. I'm now going to quote my friends from a transcript of this statement provided to us by the Leptos interpreter, Marina Pavlova, during an interview. I accompanied Nikos, the manager of Leptos, and Megrey, and interpreted during their conversation. Megrey distinguished himself from most Russian tourists by his uncompromising attitude, which bordered on tactlessness. For example, we were standing on a mountain with a terrific view of the sea and the city of Paphos. Nikos was giving the usual spiel. Look at all this natural beauty around us. What a fantastic view. I translated the sentence, but Megrey responded, it's a depressing view. Nice and warm, the sea. But look, the vegetation's all stunted. Just an occasional bush here and there. So unnatural in a climate like this. Nikos began to explain. Earlier, the island was covered with cedar forests, but when the Romans invaded, they cut down the forests to build their ships. Besides, there is very little rainfall here. To which Megrey retorted, the Romans were here many centuries ago. Over that time, new forests could have grown up, but you have not been planting them. Nikos tried to explain that there is very little rainfall on the island, and even drinking water must be collected in special reservoirs. But Megrey sharply responded, there is no water because there is no forest, and the wind carries the clouds on past the island. If there were a forest, it would slow down the movement of the lower air currents, as well as the movement of the higher altitude clouds. It would rain more often on the island. I think the reason they don't plant a forest is that they are trying to sell all the land for development. Having said this, Megrey turned aside and became lost in thought. He didn't say a word. An oppressive pause hung over us. There was nothing anyone could say. The next day, as we were having lunch at a cafe, Nikos inquired as to what he might do to make Vladimir's stay more comfortable. Megrey replied in all seriousness, there should be more Russian spoken on the island. The restaurants should serve proper fish instead of some kind of perch. The hotel rooms should be quieter. Besides, I'd rather have a forest around me than people who smile when they don't mean it. Then there was the meeting between Megrey and the head of the Leptos agency. How this came about, I have no idea. The CEO has never met with any tourists in person, and even many of his employers have never seen his face. I was present at the meeting as an interpreter, but even here, Megrey said that the company should change the layout of the sites where it was constructing its new estates. Each site should be no less than a hectare in size, a place where people can plant trees and look after them. And that way, the whole island would be transformed. If this doesn't happen, it won't be long before the island becomes an undesirable tourist destination, and Leptos will see a significant decline in business. After a moment's pause, the CEO began expounding with considerable aplomb on the island's legendary tourist sites and the most famous site of all, the baths of the goddess Aphrodite. He concluded by offering Megrae an opportunity to suggest anything that might make his stay more comfortable. While the CEO of Leptos might have been able to satisfy the wishes of many Western millionaires, what Megrae said to him in response completely threw him for a loop. It sounded like a joke, as though Megrae were making fun of him. Megrae, in all seriousness, replied, "I need to meet with the granddaughter of the goddess Aphrodite." I tried translating his sentence as a joke, but nobody laughed. The shock of the remark left everybody speechless. By and by, news of this Russian tourist eccentricities reached the ears of the hotel staff, where Megrae was staying, and they began to make fun of him. Nikos told me in conversation that, that there was something abnormal in Megrae's behaviour. Nikos and I made regular morning visits to the hotel on administrative matters, and each time Nikos would jokingly ask the clerk on duty at the main desk whether Aphrodite's granddaughter had checked in yet. The clerk would laughingly respond that she hadn't arrived yet, but there was always a room waiting for her. Megrae evidently felt the mocking glances of the hotel staff whenever he came down to the bar from his room in the evening or to breakfast in the morning. It seemed to bother him. As a Russian, I too felt uncomfortable about seeing my fellow countrymen being ridiculed, but there was no longer anything I could do. On the morning of the last day of Megrae's scheduled stay on Cyprus, Nikos and I went to the hotel as usual. Nikos wanted to say goodbye to Megrae. Once again, he greeted the desk clerk with his customary jocular inquiry, but this time the clerk's usual response was not forthcoming. The clerk, in a rather emotional frame of mind, told Nikos that Megrae had not spent the night in his room and was not in the hotel at the moment. He went on to report, in all seriousness, without even the hint of a smile, that the evening before, Aphrodite's granddaughter had come to the hotel in a motorcar and collected Megrae along with his things. She had told the clerk on duty in Greek that there was no need to be concerned, that Megrae would not be returning to the hotel, and so his room could be reassigned as needed, and that they need not bother booking Megrae's return flight to Moscow. She also asked him to tell Nikos that she would bring Megrae to the hotel at 10 o'clock the next morning to say goodbye. The clerk repeated that Aphrodite's granddaughter had talked with the hotel staff in Greek, but with Megrae in Russian. Without a clue as to what was going on, Nikos and I seated ourselves in two of the comfortable armchairs in the lobby and silently waited for the appointed hour to arrive. At 10 o'clock on the dot, the big glass doors of the main entrance swung open, and we saw Vladimir Megrae accompanied by a beautiful young woman. I had seen her before. She was Elena Fadiyeva, a Russian who lived and worked on Cyprus as a representative of a Moscow travel firm. I told you I recognized her, but not right away. This particular morning, Elena Fedeyeva looked exceptionally beautiful. Wearing a long, lightweight dress, she sported an attractive hairdo and had a cheery sparkle in her eyes. The slender young woman accompanying Megrae immediately drew the attention of the hotel staff in the lobby. Bartenders, maids, and clerks froze. In the tracks, their eyes fixed on the approaching pair. In talking with them, Nikos and I learnt that Megrae had decided to extend his stay on Cyprus by a month. When Megrae temporarily withdrew to see about something at the bar counter, Nikos remarked on Megrae's fussiness, saying he was making demands which neither he nor the Leptos CEO could possibly fulfill, whereupon Alina responded, "I have fulfilled all his wishes. I think I shall be able to fulfill any others too that may arise." Nikos continued to question Alina as to how she was able to do the impossible in just 12 hours. How could she make Megre's favourite Siberian freshwater fish appear on Cyprus, or cause cedars to grow on the island in just 12 hours, or make all the Cypriots suddenly be able to understand Megre speaking Russian? Where could she have found a place for him to stay where nobody could interrupt the solitude he so desired? Alina replied that everything Megre needed just simply appeared as though by coincidence. She put Megre up in her own villa, which just happened to be vacated at the right moment. The villa was located not far from Paphos, at the edge of the village of Peia, where nobody could possibly disturb him. She provided him with transportation by hiring a motor scooter especially for him. It turned out that her Russian friend Alla, who was also working on Cyprus, just happened to have some Siberian freshwater fish on hand, and cedars grow on a hillside not far from her villa. Besides, Megre had brought with him 2 little Siberian cedars, and she put them in pots right on at the villa's entrance. The language barrier would present no further problem for Megre, since there were telephones in all the places he wants to visit, including shops and cafes, and she always has her own mobile with her, and that way she can interpret for Megre whenever necessary, i.e., whenever he has something he wants to say to someone. As Alina and Vladimir were already making their way toward the door under the fixed stares of everyone present, I reminded Nikos that he had forgotten to ask how Alina would be able to fulfill Megre's request concerning the granddaughter of the goddess Aphrodite. Nikos looked at me in surprise and replied, "If that Russian girl isn't the living embodiment of Aphrodite or her granddaughter, then for certain the spirit of Aphrodite is present in her at this moment." My dear colleagues, after hearing Marina Pavlova describe these events of Vladimir Megre's life during his stay on Cyprus, the question naturally arose, whence came this chain of coincidences which fulfilled all Megre's stated demands in the blink of an eye? Was it really just coincidence, or was someone, like Anastasia, or the mysterious they she talks about, how shaping these coincidences? Note how immediately after the people around Megre at his hotel began to wonder what was going on, a situation turned up to remove him from the curious observer's field of vision. He retired to Alina Fadiyeva's villa. As far as the people back at the hotel were concerned, this ended the unusual chain of coincidences. But we wondered whether it had really come to an end, and so we reconstructed subsequent events in as much detail as we could, thanks to the help of what we were told both by Fadiyeva personally and by people who knew her. And what did they learn? It turned out that not only did the series of extraordinary coincidences not stop, but they became even more mysterious. I'll cite just a few excerpts from our records. So, here we have Vladimir Megre staying all by himself in Fadiyeva's small but cosy villa. He was most probably in the process of deciphering Anastasia's sayings about God, about the creation of the earth and man's destiny. He had just finished working on this part of the book, but he didn't understand everything himself yet, and true to his nature, before publishing the book, he wanted to find somewhere or in something at least a modicum of confirmation of Anastasia's unusual sayings. From time to time, he would ring up Alina and ask her to come and see him, to take him somewhere in the car, and each time the young woman would drop whatever she was doing at the moment to fulfill Megre's request, even if it meant reneging on a commitment to greet people arriving from Russia. Twice she had to reassign her duties to one of her colleagues, losing part of her income in the process. So where did Megre go? We established that, apart from the usual tourist spots, he paid a visit to 2 churches, which none of the other tourists went to, along with a monastery not on the tourist circuit and a vacant castle in the Troodos Mountains. On several occasions he climbed the ridge not far from Fadyeva's villa. He would take solitary walks among the cedars growing on the ridge while Alina waited for him down by the road. We were also able to establish that all Megre's visits to the churches and monasteries were spontaneous, i.e. not planned in advance. More specifically, they formed part of the same chain of coincidences. Here is what Alina Fadyeva told us about Vladimir Megre's nighttime visit to one of the churches. I went to see Vladimir at around 9 p.m, directly after he called. He told me he simply wanted to go for a ride around the city. He got into my car and we headed for Paphos. Vladimir seemed absorbed in his own thoughts and scarcely offered a word of conversation. We drove for about an hour or so. As we passed by all the cafes along the embankment, I suggested we stop for something to eat, but he declined. When I asked where he would like to go, he said he felt like visiting some vacant church. I turned the car around and headed full speed, I'm not sure why I was in such a hurry, to a little village. I knew there was a church there that hardly anybody visits. We drove right up to the entrance and got out of the car, not a soul around. The nighttime silence was broken only by the roar of the waves. We walked up to the main door. It was dark, but just below the door handle I could feel a large key sticking out. I turned it and opened the door. Vladimir went in and for a long time stood in the middle of the floor, below the dome. I stayed by the entrance. Then Vladimir went through the archway. The priests come out of, and must have lit a candle or something. Anyway, something there began emitting a bright glow, and the whole church interior brightened a bit. I stood for a while longer and then went out to the car. Some time later, Vladimir appeared and we left. Here is the second incident Fadyeva told us about. I wanted to show Vladimir a village way out in the country, so he could see how the local people lived. There were so many turns going off the mountain road we were travelling on, and somehow, probably by mistake, I took a wrong turn. Since instead of ending up at a village, we presently found ourselves in front of the gates to a little monastery. Vladimir wanted to go in at once and asked me to go with him to interpret with the monks, but I said I couldn't. I was wearing a rather short skirt and I had no head covering, and that's not permitted in a monastery, so I stayed outside. I watched as Vladimir walked across the courtyard. All at once he noticed a young monk in front of him. They stopped to face each other and began conversing. Then they came over to me. I could hear the young monk speaking with Vladimir in Russian, and presently Vladimir was approached by an older, grey-haired man, the Father Superior, and the two of them talked for the longest time in one of the benches in the courtyard. The monks and I were standing a little distance away, and we couldn't hear what they were talking about. Then the Father Superior and the monks gathered to see us off, but on his way out the gate, Vladimir stopped, and everybody else stopped too. Vladimir turned and headed across the courtyard to the church. Nobody followed him. We were still waiting at the gate when he came out of the vacant monastery church. And so the chain of coincidences continued. Just to remind you, Vladimir Megre was working on deciphering what Anastasia had said about God. Was it just a coincidence that at the very moment when he wanted to visit a vacant church, there at his side, coincidentally, was Alina Fadyeva, who just happened to know about such a church? Was it just a coincidence that a key was sticking out of the door of this vacant church? Was it just a coincidence that Alina made a wrong turn and ended up taking Megre to a monastery hardly anybody goes to? Was it just a coincidence that he encountered a Russian-speaking monk? We are dealing here with a chain of events, real-life situations, practically a series of seeming coincidences, sequentially arranged, all leading to some kind of predetermined end. Now that we know about such coincidences, can we still talk about the philosophical conditions Megre comes to in his books as being purely random or coincidental? Perhaps it was in some of these churches where Megre, as we now know, stood alone under the dome, that God's words became consolidated in his mind, afterward to appear in his fourth book, Co-Creation. Time and again, we have tried to trace in detail the sequence of coincidences surrounding Maigret. Among a great many others, there was one that interested us in particular, namely, how Maigret just happened to meet Alina Faddeeva. We shan't speculate as to whether this young woman was actually imbued with the spirit of the goddess Aphrodite. We'll leave this such speculation to the esoterics, but let's consider just why this girl dropped what she was doing at the very first call and rushed to Maigret's side, made him borscht and carted him around Cyprus in her motor car. Why did she change so radically, even in her appearance, after meeting Maigret? Why did her eyes suddenly begin to sparkle upon meeting Maigret, as claimed by people who know her? Perhaps it was just from meeting a celebrity, but as a representative of a travel agency affiliated with Mossad Strada, Elena gets to meet much bigger celebrities than Vladimir Maigret. Money, perhaps? But Maigret couldn't have had much money. Otherwise, he wouldn't have booked into a 3-star hotel to begin with. There is only one conclusion to be drawn from all of this. Elena Faddeeva fell in love with Maigret. This is confirmed by something she said to one of her acquaintances when the acquaintance asked her, "Well, Lena, you haven't fallen in love with this Maigret chap?" Alina responded, "I don't know. It's a rather strange feeling, but if he asked me." And so we have yet another incredible coincidence. Before us, here's a 23-year-old woman, slender, warm and outreaching, independent and pragmatic, not lacking in a fair shade of attention on the part of many men around her, suddenly falling in love at first sight at a 49-year-old man. I think you will agree that such coincidences are extremely rare indeed. We've tried analysing in still greater detail, even moment by moment, the first meeting between Vladimir Maigret and Elena Faddeeva. We spoke with the employees at the Maria Cafe who witnessed it firsthand. From what we were told by Elena herself and by the people who knew her, we have reconstructed the day of that meeting. As a result, we have been presented with yet another coincidence. But this time, what a coincidence. It could explain Elena falling in love with Maigret a few minutes before she met him for the first time. A kind of coincidence that can have an effect on both man's consciousness and his subconscious simultaneously. Picture to yourself Elena Faddeeva driving her car on the way to the Maria Cafe in a resort town. One of the waiters had rung her up and asked her to come to the cafe, if at all possible, as there was a Russian man sitting at one of the tables and getting very nervous. The cafe's sign featured its name in Russian, as well as names of Russian dishes, all of which promised a Russian-speaking waiter, but as it turned out, this person did not happen to be on the premises at the time. Elena at first declines, but then a little break happens to come up in her work, so she gets into a car and heads for the cafe, where some kind of Russian man is waiting. Along the way, she takes care to powder her suntan nose, picks an audio cassette at random, and slips it into the player in her car. The car's speaker system fills the interior with the words and melody of a Russian popular song. I am now going to remind you of the words of that song, and you, my dear colleagues, can draw your own conclusion. Here are the words Elena heard resonating from her car speakers just moments before her encounter with Maigret in the cafe. I myself am a rather young god. My experience? Perhaps there's not much to say. But still, my dear girl, I just know I could help you and shine sunlight upon your dark day. No moments to spare, you're in a crunch. You've a break coming up, hardly any time at all, so you powder your nose and head off to lunch, to meet him at a cafe. at a table by the wall. Somewhere far away, trains are flying through the wood, and planes are off course. Just why, we don't know. If he should take off, he'll be gone for good. So the answer is simple, just don't let him go. Why are you suddenly quiet, my dear? Just look into his eyes and do not be shy. I've been closing this circle for many a long year. The one who has brought him to meet you is I. And she, or someone acting through her, did not let him go. And she, or someone acting through her, fulfilled all his wishes, providing more and more information to confirm his philosophical conclusions. He returned to Russia and submitted the manuscript of his fourth book, Co-Creation, to the publishers. Thus, Vladimir Megre's life really turns out to be like the life of Ivan the Fool in the Russian folk tales, the only difference being that the events that happen to Megre are absolutely real. Faced with the reality of such phenomena, we cannot deny the existence of some kind of forces capable of purposefully influencing the destiny of an individual man. This begs a number of questions. Are these forces capable of influencing the destiny of all mankind? How active have these forces been in the past? Have they become more active in our century? What kind of forces are they? The events we have witnessed suggest the need to pay more careful attention to Anastasia's sayings. My dear colleagues, the majority of our research group is inclined toward the following conclusion. The Siberian recluse, Anastasia, while leaving the governments of the different countries in position for the time being, is actually taking personal control of the whole human civilization. Note the distinction, not seizing power, but taking personal control. Upon coming into contact with Megre's books, the majority of readers experience a desire to change their way of life. His readers already number more than 1 million, and their numbers are steadily growing. Once they have reached a critical mass, they will be capable of influencing the decisions of the world's governments. But even today, in these governments, there are to be found enthusiastic supporters of the conclusions reached in the books. In other words, our society as a whole will become just as controllable as Vladimir Megre himself. I hope there is no longer any doubt in your minds, my dear colleagues, that this Megre is an entity completely under the control of some kind of forces. I believe it is incumbent upon us, through our joint efforts, to figure out just who this Siberian recluse Anastasia is. Where is she anyway? What are her capabilities? What kind of forces are helping her? Where are they trying to lead our society? These are the questions that modern science must answer. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Breakdown. I listened to the unknown speaker's report on the audio cassette a second time. It made absolutely no difference to me who this person was. The conclusions he reached had struck me that not only did I not have any desire to continue writing, self began to seem meaningless. Anastasia's concept of man's significance was actually starting to grow on me, about how each man is the beloved child of, and that he can be happy right here on the earth. One only needs to gain an understanding of one's purpose. I believed Anastasia and believed in the possibility of life today for the better by transforming our lifestyle and building new communities. But all my faith collapsed after hearing what was on the cassette. The thing was that the facts cited by the speaker regarding the coincidences that had happened to me, which in his words formed a pattern, was spot on. Everything he said actually happened, and more. There were other things I knew about besides, things that they hadn't been able to establish. It all did happen the way he said, and that means that I've simply been a puppet in somebody's hands. It doesn't really matter whose, Anastasia's or some kind of forces or energy. That's not important. What matters is that I, as a man, am nothing. I don't exist. What exists is my flesh, which is so easily controllable by someone through arranged coincidences. It would be alright if I were the only one who could be controlled. But there may very well be other people under someone's control from above, or maybe someone on high is controlling all humanity, and all humanity is just a plaything for an invisible someone imperceptible to our human minds. I don't want to be anyone's plaything, but the facts cited in the report argue incontestably that I'm nothing. I'm being controlled, and this is clearly manifest. I can see it backed up by facts. I know all too well myself. Whatever happened to me on Cyprus wasn't bad. Quite the contrary, it was good. But that's not the point. If an invisible someone has arranged a chain of wonderful coincidences, then tomorrow it might come into somebody else's head to arrange another, not so wonderful chain of coincidences. This is relegating man to the status of a plaything. And what about mankind as a whole? How could I not have realised before that some kind of forces are playing with all mankind, like children with toy soldiers? When Anastasia talked about God and co-creation back in the Taiga, it was as though some kind of curtain had parted as a result of her words. For the first time in my life, I pictured God not as some kind of amorphous, incomprehensible being or an old man sitting on a cloud, but as a person capable of feeling, experiencing concern, dreaming and creating. My impressions from what Anastasia told me were more vivid and more comprehensible than anything I had ever heard or read before on the subject. And that wasn't all. When she spoke, my heart felt good and not so lonely, which means he exists. He can be understood and he acts, he is wise and good, and this is confirmed by his creation all around us, the cedars, the grass, the birds and the beasts. There in the Taiga, in Anastasia's glade, they are all somehow kindly, not aggressive. We're so accustomed to taking his creations for granted, we hardly pay any attention to them, but we try to appreciate him through something else instead, through some kind of secret doctrines, and we wander the planet looking for hidden sacred places, looking for teachers, looking for teachings. Now, if that isn't truly absurd, a complete absence of logic. If we talk about God as our good father, then how can we assume that he will conceal something good from his children? There is nothing he has hid or concealed from people, his children. On the contrary, he always endeavours to be right beside them. What power is it that opposes him? What power has so mesmerised us that we, through our lifestyle, have placed on the whole planet this splendid earth which he has given us under the threat of global disaster? What power is toying with us? Every evening we see the glow emanating from the windows of our many-storeyed apartment blocks. Behind every window, people's lives are unfolding. And how many of them? How many of these lives are really happy in this world? We talk about morality, love and culture. We all try to present an appearance of decency. But in reality, even by the most conservative estimate, every other man, though outwardly decent, is fooling around with women on the sly, unbeknownst to his family, which still presents a decent appearance. What is one of the most lucrative sources of our national government's income? Vodka and cigarettes. The state still maintains a tight hold of its monopoly here. But who does the drinking? The winos lolling about our fences and apartment block lobbies. Well, of course they drink too, but they don't have the financial clout to sustain the hundreds of our flourishing factories spewing out rivers of spirits. No, it is the outwardly decent and respectful folk who constitute the bulk of the consumer market here. We maintain huge police forces, not to mention personal security services and private investigation teams. What for? To round up all the winos and philanderers? Nonsense. With the forces at its disposal, internal affairs could go and collect them in a single day. It's not them they're after, but outwardly decent folk. Just think, here we have a whole army of special services, and believe me, they do not sit around with time on their hands, which means there must be a whole army out there working against them, which means that here a constant warfare is being waged, and we're all sitting right on the border between the warring parties, financing both sides. We attempt to improve the technical capabilities of one of the belligerents, namely our organs of law enforcement, yet at the same time the other side is also upgrading its own technical prowess and financing it from our pockets too. After all, money has only one source: human labour, and the war is being waged on an ever more technically advanced level. And this is not just a 1 year or 2 year conflict. It's all been going on for millennia, and nobody knows where it all started or who can put an end to it. And we're right in the midst of the action, and not one of us is neutral. We're all participants. We're all participants in a never-ending war. Some of us are directly involved in the fighting. Some finance it willingly or unwillingly. Others manufacture the arms for it. But we all proceed under the mask of decency, talking about science, technology, and culture. As an intensively developing intelligent civilization, we make ourselves look smart and utter the slogans of scientific and technical progress. Well, you smart civilization, what about all the stinking water coming out of your taps? How did you ever think up, especially with that smart appearance of yours, this business of forcing people to buy their drinking water in bottles, water which gets more expensive day by day? We are unwilling to take off our masks of decency. But why? Why do we inevitably complicate our lives this way year after year? Why are we moving so inexorably towards some stinking cesspool? And we are moving toward it, even if we don't want to admit it to ourselves. Why is nobody stopping this movement? We have religious denominations aplenty, but not one of them can stop this movement. What if they can't stop it completely, but just slow it down? If so, then that would be a form of sadism, only prolonging the period of torture. We go on thinking of ourselves as being a smart and decent civilization. But why, in this smart civilization, are women losing interest in having children? Statistics are already showing us that a nation is dying out. What kind of forces are making a complete nutcase out of man? For a whole week I was depressed and apathetic about everything. I simply lay in bed the whole time and hardly had a bite to eat. Toward the end of the week, I was suddenly overcome by fits of anger, even rage. I felt like doing at least something to counteract these forces. It didn't matter what kind of forces there were, dark or bright, just to spite anything that was trying to control us, to show them that man is capable of coming out from under their control. But what could I do to spite them? And if they, or Anastasia along with them, wanted me to write, then I would refuse to write. If meat was off the limits, then I'd eat meat and smoke and drink too. Judging by their actions, they wouldn't like that. Well, just let them try and stop me. I drank every day for a whole month. The stupor relieved me temporarily, but then came the sobriety of the following morning, and all the bad thoughts flared up in me once more. Why had I been writing? I was trying to be honest, while all along I was simply becoming a toy of amusement in goodness knows whose hands. At night time, after getting thoroughly drunk, I would make my way along the wall to my bed, and how I wanted to cry out so that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren could hear, so that they could hear and understand. I'd been writing because I couldn't take the lie of the mask any longer. I was trying to find a way out.